All right, ready to dive into forms? Let's do that. So first of all, who am I? My name is Juri Strumpflohner. I'm a Google developer expert in web technologies, specifically Angular. I'm coming from Italy, so actually the very northern part there, I'm middle in the Alps, so you can see mountains, skiing. It's quite nice there. And so I work there at a company called R3GIS. We do basically geographic information systems and create for the customer requirements, web applications with Angular, as well as also mobile applications. I'm also a freelance trainer and consultant, so I'm doing on-site workshops, and I'm also publishing video courses on NgTalks. So these are some of them. If you check them out or like them, just give me feedback. It's always nice to hear. Also what you want to see coming up in the future. That's always good feedback too. And these are the places where I'm online. So if you want to check me out there, it's basically my website, my Twitter handle, and GitHub repo. All right. So you probably know that when we talk about forms in Angular, we have these two categories, right? So we have like template-driven forms, and we have like the more model-driven forms, which are more known as reactive forms. And so just to quickly recap, template-driven forms are those where you started in template, and you have all those directives on it, right? ngModel is the most prominent one. And we pass in the data model directly, and we do a two-way data binding between them. So there's a direct connection here. Here, that form is actually quite simple, right? Just a couple of fields. And if you start like evolve that form, for instance here I took out all the other fields and I just entered here for instance a validator message, you see to extract like the input from the ngModel and then do some fancy stuff in order to show and hide the error message below. So what I want to come at is that this gets messy quite quickly, right? If the form gets really heavy and a lot of logic inside there. So what people then usually tell you is you should actually use reactive forms, right? Because they're more cool, they're more powerful, right? And so how does that work? Well, in reactive forms, you usually start on the component side, right? So you start basically coding your code down, you can use that form builder to build the model of your form inside your component class. But obviously we also have to go into the template again. We have to somehow tell Angular, look, that input field matches that property of my form model, right? So we still have to connect both of them. And also from the perspective of the code we have to write it pretty much similar, right? So we come at similar levels. And so I was curious what people drive to go to one or the other direction. So I created a Twitter poll a couple of weeks back. And you can see the distribution, right? So people were like 80% reactive and 20% model-driven, or template-driven, sorry. We had about 700 votes here, and people also commented on it. So a lot of people told me like, go reactive forms all the way because there's less magic. Like you write down the instructions in your code and you know what's being created. While the model-driven, the template-driven approach, it's more like create for you behind the scenes. Like all those form controls and form groups are created by the template. Others says like complex business validation is really hard to implement in template-driven. So you go directly in the code, which is much easier. Also, they're easy to test. John Papa said he's using both of them. He's more towards the reactive approach, but he can totally get that people entering Angular usually go for the model-driven first, for the template-driven first, sorry, because they're easier. They're already in Angular 1, and so it's much easier to get started because reactive is another thing you have to learn in order to get started with those forms. And usually it's also then like complex is reactive, simple is template-driven. But the problem is that when you go from one to the other, so what do you do if a form gets complex over time? Those are the open things. And yeah, forms is not really the most pleasant package to work with. And in fact, in my opinion, there's a lot of typing involved in forms. You have to write a lot of stuff, and write it in multiple places as well. Because if you look, for instance, at this example here, which is the one I've shown before, we have like the form model defined, and we also have to find the same one in the template as well, so in the HTML part. And so when we want to refactor that, we have to change them in multiple places again. So what I would like to do today is to go more like dynamic, configuration-based. So you might think like, well, that gets even more complex, right? But I would like to show you that it's not necessarily more complex. So what do I mean actually by dynamic configuration-based forms? So first of all, I have different levels of dynamicity, how I define them personally. So you have basically a first level, where you write the code the form configuration in your class, and then the HTML gets generated for us. And then you have the more advanced one, where actually the server side exposes you the entire configuration and the data for your form. And so that's definitely the more advanced case, because there also the backend API has to play with it. You also have to have the right database model in order to cope with the dynamic model. That would be really when the user could steer how the data he's going to input later should look like. We're going to focus on the first one today. And so we want to just have basically that TypeScript code, and out of that the form should be generated automatically in the HTML part. So if we take a look at the very simple reactive form, it's actually not that difficult to do it on our own. So here, for instance, everything is hard-coded, so we have that form control name with that first name, which we define in our template. And then in the class behind the scenes, we obviously have to create that form control, right? We have that first name again, we write your form control, and that's what gets exposed to the template. Now, if you want to make that dynamic, we could simply bind the form control name, right? If you take a look here it was hard-coded, but we could simply bind it. So we could simply create a field name in our class, tell there what will the property be like, which in this case is first name, and then further below you see in the form group I'm using here a 6 property, where I can dynamically inject or define basically the name of the property of that form group. And so in that case we already have a dynamic field, like I could change that field name to age, and it would get a model age out of the form. And we could do that for the entire object as well. So we could have a component where we pass in the object, and then what we do is simply generate the whole form group, right? So we could use, for instance, the object keys property, take that on the person, then I use here the reduce function, and then I iterate basically over properties of the object, and I create the form group control to form I. And so finally, once I have that, I assign it to the form group, and then I can simply expose it to my HTML. There, obviously, we also have to do some work, but it's rather a small amount. We simply basically iterate over the properties of that person, which we expose as well. And then we bind basically to the different kind of properties of that person object which we have. And so with that, we might get something like that, right? So we might get generated output. And it would change based on the model which we pass in. Now that works nicely. So this is basically the output which you will get. It's just a debug window. That works really nicely, but what about the input type? Right now we just have input type text, which is quite simple. What about if you want input type date or number? Then things get already more complex, right? Because then we also have to basically bind the type. So we don't have that fixed anymore, so we bind also the type as well. And so now you can see that the model properly is not enough anymore. So we need basically the data, but we also need some kind of metadata, which describes the type of fields and more other properties. And so I created a course on Egghead about that, like how you can create such a very simple dynamic form out of reactive forms with not much tooling, but just on your own. And so if you go ahead, usually the suggestion is not to probably build it on your own, because if it gets more complex, it's really hard to maintain, because like we didn't even take a look at the form validation, for instance, but also about other properties like whether an element is visible, whether it is hidden or disabled or whatever. So the things continue as you proceed. And so the general idea is when you go really heavily on these configuration, you always need a configuration part which describes how the form should look like, and the actual model with the data. Are there any Angular 1.x developers in the room? Hands up? Yeah, a couple of them. Do you recognize Angular Formally? That was actually quite a popular library in Angular 1.x. It was maintained by Ken C. Dodds. And that actually allowed us to do that, right? So we had basically a configuration, and the HTML got generated for us. And it turns out we have the same thing already in Angular, like the new version, Angular 6 and onwards. It's as well, but it lives under that NGX Formally namespace, so you can find it with that name on NPM. And I would like to dive a bit into that library because only a few people know about it, but it's really powerful under the hood. So how does it work? This is a very important part already, because as you can see, NGX Formally already supports a huge number of front-end UI frameworks if you want, right? Because if you think about a form, a template, the form base written in Angular material is different probably than written in Bootstrap. Like you may require other HTML elements in order that the styles properly work. And so they already have support for Material, Bootstrap, Prime, and even on the mobile part with Ionic and NativeScript. So that's really cool because then you can just pick the part you need on the UI part and then pick the core library basically, which will have the core business logic underneath for generating the form. So how does the installation work? Really simple. Just pick the part and your framework of choice, like Material in this case, also obviously with Cure. And what I call then, there's another approach of installing which is ngAddMagic. Like you probably know that with one of the latest versions of Angular CLI, now library authors can provide basic schematics that will set up your project. So it will install and set up for you. And the guys from ngXformly did that. So what you can do is just ngadd ngXformly/schematics. You pass in a parameter which is the UI theme you want to use. And it will then basically set up that everything for you, and it will also modify your code and insert already that Formly module for root, which sets up basically the basics for Formly to run on your project. So how does it work? Like if you take a look at this very simple form for now, what we have again is that field configuration and model part. So that's the same thing which also Formly took over. And so the field configuration is basically the one that configures your form, of course. It defines like the type of fields you want to show for a given property. It does, of course, also the data binding stuff. All right. And that's also validation and other control properties, like controlling whether the field is visible, whether it's enabled, disabled, and so on. And so a very simple field configuration for Formly looks something like that. So you have basically the key property, which in this case is the first name, and that's the property name of the model you want to bind. And then you obviously have to specify which type you want, which is in this case type input, and then the label you want to show beneath it. So here I show a very minimal configuration. There's a lot of other options, of course, which you can use on it. And then we have the model part. That's quite easy. That's actually the data model we want to display. So in this case, the person object. This is the one we want to modify and send back, obviously, to the server or to some API, right? And it could look like this, for instance. So in the template part, we also have to do something with Formly. So it's not that the template gets out like magic. So it's very minimal. What we can do, and what is also nice, is you can just use a normal reactive form. So there's not just some magic component which you add there. So you start with the reactive form, you have the usual NgOnSubmit event on it, and then you have that Formly form component which you just place inside. And that takes then the model and the configuration. And based on that, it generates, of course, the different kind of controls we want to have. And then you have the buttons inside, which are just normal buttons. Yeah, you can have them inside the Formly form component or also outside, but normally inside your form in order that the submit button, submit event actually works. So how do we actually adjust the input type? Now let me quickly switch over here to my code editor. Can you see this? Yeah, should work. So what you see here on the side, I have a very simple form. There's actually nothing displayed yet because we didn't actually configure it. Here we have just a debug output, which shows me the form value, which is currently empty because there is anything. And we have the model. The model is already populated because it's basically the model I'm having here, right? And so if I want to create such setup now with Formly, I already bound it in my HTML part. So I just have to focus here on the code part. So I could actually use now the key, write first name, for instance. Then the type would be input, right? Because we want an input text. And then we have the template options where we specify the type of label which you want to display beneath. So I'm just placing here label, first name, right? And if I save that, we should already see here besides the form output that gets generated. And it all binds, as you can see below, with the form value. And the nice thing is that Formly also binds it with the model. So if I change that, you can see that the model is automatically updated as well. And so if you just want to, for instance, check or change a couple of properties of your model, you could just create the form inside there for those properties, but you still would have the ID property and everything set up, so you don't have to care about how to carry them over. And in the same manner, we could just create another input part here, but let's change the type. For instance, let's map here that age property. So I'm just using the same property here. We still have an input because it's an input type age, right? Here I am adding the label, and then I'm changing it to type number, basically in the template options below here. And the difference is now, if you take a look at this field, you see those buttons on the side, right? And with these buttons, I'm being able basically to go up and down. And I can enter like numbers and not like normal parts like alphanumeric data. Another thing I would like to show is the city ID. That's basically the ID of the city I want to display on the form, but I'm usually taking that out of a select, right? And so that would work quite similarly. Again, the key would be city ID. The type here is select, because it's a select box. Then we have the template options, again, quite similar. I'm adding here the label, which is city. And now obviously we have to provide the data in some way, right? Because that's different to an input type box, or text box basically. And so you can just pass in that options, which can then be an array, which usually has a value and label property. So the value would be 1, which would be the ID, the label like, let's say Bolzano, which is my hometown. Let's copy that over just to have 2 entries here. Let's add here Rome. And if I save this now, the form will again update. As you can see, I don't have to touch the HTML part, and I get here already the autocomplete, like the select box with the different kind of entries. And it also already binds, right? You have seen already Bolzano is being selected, and if I change that, you can see how it updates down again, of course. And so normally you don't really have it hard-coded, right? Unless you have just a couple of options, which won't change ever. So what you normally do is you get them from some service which calls the backend. And so what is really nice about Formly is that here, for instance, I set up already a city, get cities, which turns an observable, which you would expect from an HTTP call. Now in this example, I'm just creating it on the fly, obviously. But what I can do now, if I have that service injected here in my component, I can simply do this .cityService.getCities, and that's it. So I'm saving that. You can see now it refreshes. And we have now all the cities loaded in here. Data binding already works. All right? So that's really nice. So observables are first-class members as well here in Formly, which is really, really a powerful approach. And so here, this is just for your reference later, that you can check out the slides and play with them. Another really important part is our expressions, how they are called in Formly. Because obviously, when you have a form, you will have like fields which get displayed or hidden based on other fields, based on user permissions or whatever, right? And so in Formly, we can use something that is called expression properties. And as you can see, the expression properties allow us to manipulate those template options above. So what I can say here, for instance, is like template options not disabled. So whenever like the city is not chosen, that zip code will be disabled because it doesn't make sense, for instance, to enter that zip code. And so you can see down here, I'm just telling basically set the disable to true whenever that city ID is not defined. So the form will be disabled. And obviously once the city is chosen, it will be enabled. And you can use those magic strings if you want, or you can also use the callback, which you always get from Formly. So we'll get the model basically, which is data mounted automatically, and you get also the form state behind the scenes. And so you can use just that approach as well. In version 5, we're currently in version 4 with Formly. So in version 5 alpha, which is already out there, you can even directly assign observables to those values. So it gets even more powerful, because now an observable that the value is to a Boolean value in this case would already work, right? And would also update once new values are emitted automatically. So I'm really looking forward for that approach. Another thing is also hiding elements, right? You want to hide them when some form elements are selected. Now in this case, I even basically show another approach. So for instance, I'm telling here, whenever the person chooses the city, I want to just print out a nice message. So thanks for choosing the city. And so in this case, I'm just using a template because I'm actually not really having a form control for that, right? There's no input something. So it's just a plain HTML part. So I can use the template property, put in there the HTML, and then I use that hide expression below, again with the callback, to hide or show that form value. Do you hear me? Yeah, perfect. So another thing is input validation, right? When you create a form, you obviously want people to have like some nice messages when they enter like text, so that they don't have to wait until they submit. And Formly got you covered there as well. So the most simple thing you have to do is actually just add that required true to the template options, and you're already set up. Now you might wonder where the message comes from, because you obviously have to display a message below, right, below the field. And here we have different kind of possibilities. Like we can either use in the Formly for root, where we basically display our for root message, we can enter basically the name of the validator and the message beneath, and so that would hold for the entire application. Or if you have a more specific case, you can directly hook that into the validation methods of your Formly configuration, right? That's when you want to personalize it a bit more. Now let me show some more advanced stuff. One thing is dependent fields. Like we have that all the time. Like when you choose the nation up there, you want to automatically update the city below, right? And so in Formly, you can do that by using those lifecycle events. They're very similar to the actual component lifecycle events. So what we could do is simply hook onto that onInit. We get the form, the field, which we have, which in this case is the city, and basically based on that, based on those values, we can just use the normal reactive forms code. So we can just get the nation ID, hook onto the value changes, which is an observable, pipe through that, and basically do whatever we have to do. In this case, I'm resetting the city ID, which is currently visualized, and I'm dynamically loading the template options, filtering out all the cities that match for that nation. It's actually quite simple. Also custom form controls. That's really important, of course, because if you have like a custom style guide in your company, you want to actually adapt your controls such that they work within Formly. What I did here is, for instance, the autocomplete case, right? I'm using here NgSelect, for instance, and I definitely want to have that option inside Formly as well. And so it's actually quite straightforward. What you have to do is like wrap that into such a Formly component. So I have my NgSelect inside there. And then basically here's an expanded version. I'm binding those properties of NgSelect to that TO variable. And that TO variable comes from that field type I'm extending. And so these are basically the template options we have seen before, which you configure, right? And so that would already work. We now have to register that new type in Formly, calling it my autocomplete, and passing in the instance of like the component. And then I can use it in my Formly configuration. Actually pretty straightforward. And so I definitely recommend you to read the source in this case, because obviously we have already those customizations for material, for bootstrap, and so on. Just go look at the source code and check how they did it basically for their own library. And the final thing is a custom DSL. Try to customize it down for your own project. Like what I did, for instance, is I created a Formly service and have methods on it, like for creating input, for creating checkboxes, and so on, and then pass in my configuration, which is really simple. It is cut down for what I need. And so the Formly configuration now looks much simpler. I just call that Formly service inside that configuration and tell him, give me an input with that property in that label. You can even go a step further for that select down here, for instance, and create a city select. Because you know it will always be city ID in your model, and it will always fetch the data from that place. So why not? So customize down, tailor it for what you actually need. And it will help you have those repetitive form configurations. It would also go better when you maybe have to change or handle potential breaking changes in the configuration because you have them in one place, and it would already work. And there are more stuff. Definitely check out here the link at the bottom, because they have basically examples which are running in the website with the stack-based example already linked. Also go online on GitHub. They're really, really reactive at responding on new feature requests or problems in configuring Formly. So really, really cool people. To quickly conclude, that's a nice quote from Bram. He uses Formly a lot. He usually starts with TemplateDriven, just a prototype, and then he switches over to Formly once he knows that's the form I'm going to build. So in general, it's really powerful. They're easy to create, highly customizable and flexible, because you can see we have custom types to enter there. It's also very suitable if you have really, really heavy form-driven and data-driven applications, of course. It needs a bit more work if you're having a really, really highly customized, personalized corporate style guide, because initially you have to set up those wrappers for Formly, but once you have them in place, you can go straight ahead, and you're really quick at implementing your forms. So I would really thank Abdelatif Eid Boudat. He's the core maintainer of Formly. He's so responsive on issues, and I don't know how he's managing it. I'm having problems to follow up just issues, reading them, and he's already resolving them. So really, really cool guy. All right, so if you have questions for me, just reach out to me later outside or contact me on Twitter. Thank you.